So I'm very pleased you're here. As Leslie said, this has been a process, putting this deliberation together. The first deliberation was around the public purposes of higher education. It's called Shaping Our Future, and we had about 140 deliberative forums around the country. Campus Compact did a number in Minnesota. And we found out a lot about what people think about higher education, which is, of course, a very important topic today in North Carolina and around the country. And then in the process of putting this deliberation together, we had a design team of Twin Cities-based institutions, and also including Julie Plout, the director of Minnesota Campus Compact. And we had 6, so Augsburg, Hamline University, 2 privates, Metropolitan State University, and 3 community colleges, Century, Minneapolis Community and Technical College, and St. Paul College. And together, in the concern gathering process, we talked to about 1,000 people putting this together. So we really got a strong feeling of what people feel about the changing world of work, why this is such a critical topic. We had found in the Shaping Our Future that focusing on this particular area was a way of getting at a lot of the deeper concerns people had. So this is an extraordinarily important deliberation that gets to the heart of what people are worried and concerned about. What kind of jobs are there going to be in the future? And how can higher education be a resource, not detached from this process? The other thing I want to say to frame this, and we'll go into this more after we go around and have introductions and just a short statement of why you came, what you want to get out. But I would say that thinking about deliberation is important not simply for the deliberative process itself, learning how to listen, how to think in bigger terms, how to kind of lower the temperature of conversations. It's a very important pedagogical practice. But it's especially important when we see this as part of the revival of the democratic atmosphere and spirit in higher education. And when we see a key to that is revitalizing both on campuses and in the larger society, public spaces where people of different views can engage each other in productive ways. And this is not a partisan question. Leslie is going to print a column that a colleague of ours who's we worked with for many years, Jay Tice at Lone Star, is the director of chair of social studies, Lone Star Community College in Houston. They've been able to make relationships with the Tea Party in Texas around the idea of public spaces and public deliberation and the need to not to be captive of the nationalized, hyper-polarized discourse in Washington and in the media. And they were able, because of that, to pass a bond to increase funding for community colleges this last election after three previous failures. So there's really political power in the idea of public spaces. And their habits and practices. We'll talk more about that. So let me begin by the challenge we face. I mean, there are obvious challenges, attacks on higher education. I know North Carolina has some trouble, but you're not like Arizona, where the governor has proposed zeroing out of the state budget the 2 major community college systems. Or Wisconsin, where the governor has proposed a $300 million cut in state universities. And also the excision of the land-grant mission. So that on the one hand. On the other hand, all this negative press, from University of Virginia to Oklahoma to Irvine, goes on and on. Now in this context, I think there's a deep reason to reconnect with our roots. And I would say our cultures have, in general, lost the sense of ourselves as a movement, and especially a movement about democracy. And connected to that, we've lost as a society a sense of what democracy is. So if you look at the official government definition of democracy on the USAID website, which is distributed around the world, strategic plan, democracy is defined very simply as free elections and universal franchise. In 1947, when the President Truman's Commission on Higher Education defined the fundamental purpose of higher education, it declared that the fundamental purpose, the most essential charge, is that it shall be the carrier of democratic values, ideals, and purposes. Now, that was not simply about elections. That was about democracy as a way of life. It was about democracy as a journey, not a destination, in the words of William Hastie. It's not somewhere we get, something we build. As Elaine Locke, the great architect of the Harlem Renaissance cultural movement, put it, democracy involves cultural and social dimensions and economic dimensions. It's not simply about elections. John Dewey called it a way of life. And higher education was at the center of that deep definition of democracy. So yesterday I talked about the University of Michigan, which was one of the pioneers in the 19th century of broadening the understanding of the democracy and higher education. The president, James Angell, who was the president from 1871 to 1909, talked about creating a democratic atmosphere at the University of Michigan, which meant a lot of different things. It meant collaborative work with partners across the state. John Dewey, who was there and was his formative experiences, had a network of high school teachers that he worked with around democracy education. It meant shifting from a lecture model to much more seminar, active participation. It meant public forums across the campus, which were full of discussion and debate about the issues of the day. It meant women being admitted. It had already been racially integrated. So it meant a lot of different dimensions, and that continued to deepen for the first half of the 20th century at places like the University of Minnesota or City College in New York, which I would say were infused with an ethos of cooperative excellence, which we've largely lost. So City College, the nation's intellectual powerhouse right next to Harlem, in the 1930s and 40s, which graduated 11 Nobel Prize winners, or had faculty who had 11 Nobel Prize winners, allowed every student who graduated from high school in New York to go, and it was free. It was founded on the principle that a mix of students from many different backgrounds in a demanding and challenging intellectual and civic and social environment could achieve greatness that a focus on individual stars couldn't achieve. That's the cooperative ethos that once was at the very heart of the democratic meaning of higher education that I think we've seen significantly erode in the rankings wars and the scrambles for prestige and so forth. So that's our understanding, and our understanding is that deliberation is one important practice towards the revitalization of a much deeper, richer understanding of democracy that people are hungry for in our society. It's like our imaginations have shrunk, and our controversies and our issue fights and so forth in part reflect a kind of shrinking, a kind of sourness, a kind of narrowness. So let me just mention the way we think about deliberative forums are a revival of relational public culture and public spaces on campuses. And this is the one way to think about it. So I would say in our society we're really divided in terms of our experience, our worlds, our imaginations between private life on the one hand, I think this is a global pattern, and then a kind of abstract public world on the other. So the private world is the world of people we think are like us, whether they are or not. Looking for sameness, looking for homogeneity, looking for, we all are on the same page. It's the world of subjectivity, it's the world of identity, it's the world of relationships, important. It's also spreading around the world with this identity politics. We are the pure, the true, the righteous, and other people are outside the chosen people. So that's the purely private, and then it's in kind of dysfunctional relationship with an abstract notion of public, which is impersonal. It's the world of big data. It's the world of information. So information and big data are going to save us. Look how well that's working. The language of evidence-based programming. It's the language of large institutions. So a relational public culture draws from both of these and holds these in combination and creates public spaces for discourse and dialogue and deliberation, which are neither the abstract public nor the private world. So just to mention several dimensions. It's a democratic spirit. It's a world of diversity and learning to engage people who make you uncomfortable. So it has tension, it has difference, it actually stretches your imaginations. There's a lot of information, we have a lot of knowledge that students, whatever they say in their first generalization, want to break out of their bubbles. The New York Times did a huge study of college students who say, we really want to break out of our bubbles. There's a widespread understanding that people live in bubbles these days. It's the world of respect, not intimacy. And here, there's a tremendous confusion in our culture between public and private. They're collapsed. There's no distinction. People think you tell your private secrets on Facebook without understanding that actually what you accomplish in public world with people who are unlike you, who you may not agree with, is different than what you accomplish in your private life. This is a conversation we don't have time to go into in depth today, but I want to highlight the fact that the public world of difference, of people who come from a different culture, background, different ideology, is different than your private world. And learning the skills of negotiating a public life, solving problems, developing power, developing agency with people who are unlike you is extraordinarily important, and very few places are places where people develop those skills. In private life, you get intimacy, you get nurturance, you get love. Public spaces are not families. They're diverse people. Mary and I were talking about that. And finally, I would say public spaces depend on public and civic and democratic habits. And today we're talking about a set of habits that are important as part of a larger repertoire of democratic practices and skills. So deliberation is a democratic practice and set of habits that really is about lowering the temperature of conversation, slow thinking in the language of Kahneman. It's about learning the skills of listening deeply. There are other skills that are actually also very connected to this, like what we talked about yesterday, public narrative, learning that you have a story and that everybody has a story. And learning to listen deeply for other people's animating passions, their interests, extraordinarily important. But the deliberation is a beginning to learning to listen. And in the best of cases, not seeking for agreement, but expanding people's thinking, imagination. You learn from people who are different, and that's a skill, and that's a discipline, and it's a habit. You learn to look at different kinds of evidence, not simply your kind of evidence. You learn other people's stories have relevance to your lives. So I would say deliberative practices and the spaces in which they develop are consonant with the best values of higher education. It's why higher education has to play a leadership role, but we've lost a lot of those disciplines and practices. So respect for different points of view, for evidence, for dialogue across fields, for thinking deeply, for asking questions, for inquiry, for critical thinking. Those are all values that higher education espouses, but to be democratic values, they need to be part of a relational public culture, and we live in very fragmented, compartmentalized, siloed cultures in higher education where we also often don't even show each other our syllabi and courses, much less actually actively interact. So we have a great challenge, but deliberation can help, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, are there any questions or comments before we go on this point? We'll have time to debrief at the end too, because actually what we want to do is think about deliberation in the context of the challenges and the possibilities facing higher education. The first principle of a deliberation, of a forum, is to invite the group to set ground rules, to co-create your ground rules. So ground rules are things like you don't interrupt, you don't scream. So there are different roles in a forum. The moderator role is responsible especially for these principles. You be sure that people don't dominate. You keep attentive to the process and be sure that it stays on track, doesn't wander off into, the price of oil in Saudi Arabia. You give the different options in this particular version of deliberation. You give roughly the same time to the different options. So you need a timekeeper. That's another role, somebody who keeps on time. You maintain an atmosphere for discussion, a deliberative discussion. People are not arguing with each other. They're talking about how they see the question, how they understand it from their point of view. You keep in mind that listening is really a critical skill and habit, really, in the process of deliberation. And in general, you always keep in mind, what could we actually do about this? But we'll come to that at the end, too, because actually thinking about this as a strategy of making connections between campuses and communities, finding partners, thinking about how this can launch an ongoing conversation is very important. So the other roles to keep in mind are recorder. And so when we break into groups, if you could have somebody record, just agree to record. Our participant, an active participant who takes responsibility for their own words. And then another, I think we don't need it here, but in many deliberations where you have a lot of subject matter knowledge, and you might have people who are experts, you have experts on tap, not on top. You don't let experts dominate, but you have people who know something that you can call on in particular. Sometimes expert actually, if there's somebody who really knows an area, is best not to be just a regular participant, but somebody you can call on. And also other kinds of roles. Like if, for example, if you have a political leader, a politician in the group, you've got to be wary, because like experts, they're likely to talk too much, likely to take over. But those are all different roles. This is how a deliberation goes. First of all, you have somebody summarize an overview of the issue. I did that by saying this comes out of a lot of discussions. We know that it's of central concern. The way we're working on this today is to look at different approaches to how higher education can be a resource for communities in dealing with the changing world of work. But the moderator reminds people of the topic. Now, the second stage is to ask people for their personal stake in the question. And this is actually quite important. So a deliberation is a kind of blend of head and heart. You don't want people simply to be in their heads. You want people to claim their own interests, their own stories, their own passions about that. So to have people begin with what is your personal stake, and there's several different dimensions. What experience do you have around this question? How does this question affect you? What concerns you or worries you about the question? That's a beginning. So having everyone go around and briefly say how this affects them would be a good beginning. And then the moderator briefly goes over the three options. Now, in this deliberation, the first option is that colleges and universities should prepare students for the job market. Secondly, colleges and universities should not simply prepare people for today's jobs or the job market, but actually to be innovators and creative agents and change makers. Now, I should note, having been involved, coordinated the design process, this took a lot of work to come to that. And actually, to your point, Mary, you know who was really a powerful voice in this was students. So it suggested students actually are thinking beyond simply preparation for today's jobs. They really wanted to know how to have jobs that matter, as well as pay, in the words of Julie Ellison, one of our colleagues, but also how to have jobs that are full of public purpose for themselves, that tap their passions and interests, that meet society's needs. So this is an active agency theme. And the third is coming out of something called the anchoring institution work, which some of you may know. So that's how higher education, colleges and universities can think as whole institutions about their own resources for communities in dealing with economic change, job change, and other events. So, for example, how a college can be a role model through its hiring practices, or through its paid leave vacation time practices, or through its wage practices. So that raises questions, for example, of adjunct faculty, and do they get visibility and recognition? How can a college think about its economic impact on the community in terms of its purchasing power? Where is it actually buying things from? Does it support local vendors? Should it support local businesses? How can higher education think about its spaces? Spaces that communities might use. How can higher education think about its educational resources like libraries, not only for its students but for the larger community? So the anchoring institution communities is sites that actually often are in great need of the resources that colleges have to bring is a third option.